I walked into that lawyer's office with nothing but an old envelope and a broken heart. Inside that envelope were 25 years of sacrifice, an outdated will, a house deed that never had my name on it, and a worn letter from the only person who had ever loved me without asking for anything in return. I sat down across from a stranger, but by the time I walked out of that office, I wasn't the same woman anymore. That was the day I stopped waiting for respect and quietly took my life back. My name is Celeste Monroe, and this is the story of how I went from forgotten stepmother to a woman who reclaimed everything they tried to steal from me. When people talk about motherhood, they often talk about birth stories or first steps, about little hands wrapping around your fingers and soft giggles in the early mornings. My version of motherhood came wrapped in chaos with no blood connection, no legal paperwork, and no guarantees of love in return. My name is Celeste Monroe, and I spent 25 years quietly being a mother, even when no one thought to call me one. I was 38 when I met Martin. I'd stopped dreaming about a family by then. Life had its way of pushing me through routines, clocking in, clocking out dinners for one, and quiet weekends. Martin was warm in a way I hadn't realized I missed. We met at the local community fundraiser, both volunteering for the same food drive, and by the end of the evening, we found ourselves talking about books, about music, about silly things like the best pie crust recipes. He made me laugh, but more than that, he made me feel noticed. But Martin didn't come alone. He came with two little shadows trailing behind him. Trevor, who was 7, and Sienna, just 5. Their mother had disappeared 2 years earlier, gone off somewhere overseas, leaving no forwarding address, no goodbye. Martin's smile always dulled a little when he mentioned her. "It's just us now," he used to say with a shrug that tried to seem casual but never quite succeeded. The first time I met the kids, they looked at me with wide, cautious eyes. Not hostile, but wary in the way children become when life teaches them not to trust too quickly. I remember how Trevor stood half behind Martin's leg, clutching a half-broken toy car, and Sienna had her fingers curled tightly around a tattered blanket. There was no welcoming hug, no instant connection, just quiet introductions and stiff, polite greetings. But something about their smallness, their guardedness pulled at me. I never planned to become a mother, let alone a stepmother, and definitely not a substitute for a woman who had vanished without a trace. But life doesn't always ask your permission before handing you a role. At first, I was just the nice lady who came over for dinners. Then I was the person who picked them up from after-school activities when Martin's work ran late. And then I became the one who packed their lunches, who sewed up the knees of their jeans when they tore them during soccer practice, who kissed their foreheads when fevers spiked in the middle of the night. Martin used to joke, "You don't need to fill out any papers, Celeste. Love's bigger than paperwork." And maybe in those early years I believed that too. We married quietly, just the 4 of us, at a small ceremony by the lake. No big celebrations, no extended family drama. It was simple, heartfelt, and enough. Or so I thought. Being a stepmother wasn't always easy. Trevor had a stubborn streak, the kind that made mornings a battlefield when it came to getting dressed or eating vegetables. Sienna cried for her missing mother during thunderstorms, whispering questions I could never answer, but I stayed. Through scraped knees and science projects, through broken hearts and teenage rebellion, I stayed. My days were stitched together by quiet sacrifices. Early mornings packing lunches, late nights folding laundry, double shifts at the diner when Martin's construction business hit a slow season. There were vacations where I stayed back to budget birthday parties, where I stood behind the camera, capturing their smiles, holidays, where my gifts were always the ones carefully thought out, but often dismissed the quickest. I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I didn't. I was building a family, wasn't I? Years folded into each other. And before I knew it, I was the only mother figure they consistently had. I was the one who sat through parent-teacher conferences, who taught Sienna how to braid her hair, who helped Trevor practice for his driver's license test. Martin always made sure to remind them, "You owe Celeste more than you know, but I never asked for repayment. I thought love was enough." Then life decided to pull the rug out from under me. Martin's diagnosis came one gray January morning. Pancreatic cancer, Aggressive, unrelenting, we fought it hard. Chemotherapy, special diets, every natural remedy recommended by neighbors and old friends. But by the summer of my 57th birthday, I was standing alone in our backyard, staring down at the hydrangeas he'd been trimming before collapsing. I remember how quiet the house became after his funeral. Sienna had already moved out for college. Trevor was starting his career. They came home for the ceremony, promised to visit more often, to call to check in. I remember those hugs, those whispered reassurances. "We'll look after you, Mom." For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe the bond we built would survive Martin's absence. But silence grows in strange ways. The calls became fewer, the visits shorter. Messages trickled in only on birthdays or holidays. Trevor's texts turned transactional questions about bills, about property taxes, about whether I'd considered downsizing now that I was all by myself in such a big place. Sienna's emails were polite but distant, filled with updates about her life, but no questions about mine. I brushed it off. Told myself they were busy, that young adults had their own lives to build. But there's a kind of ache that builds slowly. You don't notice the loneliness right away. It comes in the form of dinners eaten alone at a table built for four and the sound of the television filling the silence, in the way birthdays start to feel like just another Tuesday. I told myself I was fine. I had always been strong, always been the glue holding things together. I'd survived Martin's passing. I'd handled raising 2 kids who weren't even biologically mine. I could weather this quiet too. After all, that's what mothers do. Stepmothers especially. We show up, we stay. We make sure everything keeps running, even if no one says thank you. I kept the house spotless, tended to the garden. Martin loved, volunteered at the local church just to have someone to talk to. I told myself I was doing okay, until little things started chipping away at that illusion. Trevor would pop by not for a visit, but to check the mailbox. Sienna's calls revolved more and more around finances. Neighbors started making comments like, "Funny how we see you out here all alone, but not your kids." And I'd smile, wave it off, but the cracks had already started to show. Looking back, maybe I should have seen it sooner. Maybe I should have realized that the bonds I thought were unbreakable were just loosely tied strings from my end, completely severed from theirs. But back then, I still believed love was enough. Back then, I didn't realize I was raising children who were only waiting for me to become an afterthought. And I had no idea that one day they wouldn't even wait for me to be buried before counting my belongings. But that part of the story comes later. For now, I was still living under the illusion that motherhood, no matter how it came to you guys, was supposed to mean something. That decades of sacrifices, of sleepless nights, of putting their needs above my own would eventually come back to me in the form of care, of respect, of love. I didn't know how wrong I was. Not yet. Grief has a strange way of making the world feel hollow. After Martin's funeral, I thought the worst was behind me. I imagined the house would be emptier, the mornings quieter, but I believed the relationships I'd built over 25 years would hold me steady. I clung to the memory of Trevor standing beside me at the graveside, Sienna gripping my hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. I let myself believe those quiet moments meant something lasting. The first few weeks after the funeral were a blur of flowers wilting on the porch and sympathy cards gathering dust on the kitchen counter. I received daily calls from both Trevor and Sienna, checking in, asking how I was holding up, offering to stop by. For a while, I felt comforted. I cooked small dinners for myself, watched old movies Martin used to love, and reminded myself I still had family. But as the weeks became months, the calls slowed. The once frequent text messages turned into occasional emojis, brief check-ins that felt more like obligation than care. I told myself it was natural that life was pulling them back into routines, that the absence of their father was creating spaces they didn't know how to fill. I told myself all kinds of stories to explain the growing distance. Then came the big announcement. Trevor called late one night, too late for a casual chat, and told me he'd proposed to Madison. I wanted to be happy for him. I congratulated him. I asked questions about the proposal, about the wedding plans, But there was a hollow space in the conversation. He didn't ask how I was coping. He didn't mention wanting me involved in any plans. When I finally met Madison, it was in the briefest of introductions. Her handshake limp, her smile tight, her eyes avoiding mine. She called me Celeste. Never mom or even stepmom, just my first name like I was a distant acquaintance. I convinced myself it didn't matter. What mattered was that Trevor was happy. Then Sienna announced she was moving across the country accepting a job in another state. I swallowed my own sadness and celebrated with her, told her how proud I was, how brave she was for taking the leap. But her phone calls came less and less. Months passed with nothing but quick text messages, usually revolving around bills she needed help with, rent she was short on, or emergencies that somehow always required me to wire money. Holidays became the heaviest weight to carry. That first Thanksgiving after Martin passed, I woke up before dawn like I always had, pulling out the old family recipes, setting the table just like Martin would have wanted. I made Trevor's favorite pumpkin pie, the one he'd begged me to make every single Thanksgiving since he was 10. I roasted the turkey with all the trimmings, mashed the potatoes until they were whipped and buttery, arranged the cranberries in the same old crystal dish Martin's mother had passed down to me. I waited all day. I had convinced myself they'd show up late, that maybe traffic was bad, that maybe they'd knock on the door carrying flowers and apologies for the delay. By sundown, the pie sat untouched on the counter, the turkey getting cold. Trevor had texted 2 words: "Can't make it." Sienna hadn't bothered to send anything at all. I sat alone at the table, one plate set out, candles burning down to stubs. I ate a slice of pumpkin pie by myself, the sweetness turning bitter in my mouth. I packed up the leftovers into Tupperware containers, labeling them like I was still expecting someone to come by later. I wiped the counters clean, folded the festive tablecloth, and stood in the doorway of the dining room, realizing it had been transformed from a gathering place into a museum of silence. Time kept moving, but the distance between us stretched wider. The next time Trevor called, it wasn't to ask how I was or how the house was holding up without Martin. It was to casually mention that the house was probably too big for me. Now how downsizing might be a smart option. He spoke about it like he was doing me a favor, like I hadn't spent years filling these rooms with memories, with late-night study sessions, with birthday parties, with quiet, ordinary mornings sipping coffee while watching the hydrangeas bloom outside the kitchen window. Sienna's calls came with similar undertones. She never asked about my day, about my health, about how I was managing the loneliness. Her voice only grew soft when she asked about life insurance policies Martin had left behind, about whether I'd considered setting up beneficiaries, or what I planned to do when the time comes. She always said it with a laugh, like it was harmless curiosity, but there was something sharp beneath it, something that made my chest tighten in a way I didn't fully understand yet. I brushed it off because that's what mothers do, don't they? We make excuses for our children. We tell ourselves they're busy, they're stressed, they have their own lives to juggle. I told myself the same story every single day. I told myself they loved me, they just forgot to show it sometimes. I told myself if I kept being supportive, if I kept reaching out, they'd come back around. But sometimes when the house creaked in the quiet hours of the night, when I sat staring at the framed photos lining the hallway, Trevor in his graduation robe, Sienna holding her first job offer letter, I felt something colder, something emptier settling in my chest. A whisper of doubt, a question I didn't want to ask. Did they ever really see me as their mother, or just as someone who filled the gaps when their real one vanished? Still, I tried. I reached out. I invited them over for birthdays, for anniversaries, for Sunday dinners. They always had reasons not to come. Work trips, personal commitments, last-minute emergencies. Madison's family seemed to occupy Trevor's weekends more than I ever could. Sienna's social media was filled with photos of vacations, brunches, smiling faces I didn't recognize. And every time I asked about visits, about time together, I was met with the same rehearsed responses, the same hollow reassurances. Next time, Celeste, we'll plan something soon. Don't stress about it, you know we love you. But love doesn't look like silence. Love doesn't look like ignored holidays or forgotten birthdays or cold pies sitting alone on a dining table. Love doesn't sound like voices asking about property value instead of your well-being. I remember one afternoon sitting on the porch with Diana, my neighbor, who'd been more present in my life those past months than my own stepchildren. She glanced over the top of her gardening magazine and said quietly, "It's funny how they only call when they need something." I forced a smile brushed her comment away like a pesky fly, but it stayed with me lingering in my chest long after the sun had set. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to hold on to the image I'd built for so many years. That family stuck together, that love was unconditional, that decades of sacrifice couldn't be so easily forgotten. I wanted to believe they were just busy, just distracted, just temporarily distant. But deep down, I was starting to understand the truth. And even though I didn't realize it yet, my silence wasn't protecting peace anymore. It was hiding the first cracks of betrayal. It's a strange thing realizing you've been invisible in your own home. For years, I thought the warmth of familiar walls, the comfort of routines, and the hum of daily life meant I belonged. I thought that after everything I'd given, everything I'd stayed for this house would always be mine. Not just in bricks and mortar, but in spirit. I was wrong. It was Diana who first made me notice the small details. Diana Holloway, my next-door neighbor. The kind of woman who never misses a thing. She had a sharp tongue when she wanted to, but an even sharper eye, especially when it came to the people around me. She was the one who brought me lemons from her backyard after Martin passed. She never asked questions, just left them on the porch with a little note that said, "For when things get too sweet to be real." One breezy afternoon, we sat on my porch, the old wooden swing creaking beneath us. Diana watched Trevor's car pull into my driveway and leaned in just a little. "Funny, isn't it?" she said, swirling the ice in her glass. "How they only seem to come around when males do." I blinked, surprised. She didn't stop there. "You ever notice how it's always the bank envelopes he's after, not your well-being?" I wanted to brush it off, tell her she was wrong, that Trevor just liked to help out with the errands. Maybe wanted to make sure I wasn't overwhelmed with paperwork, but the words stuck in my throat, because deep down I'd noticed it too. Trevor didn't ask about the garden Martin loved so much. He didn't comment on the new curtains I'd picked up to brighten the kitchen. His eyes always went to the countertop where I left unopened mail, to the spot near the door where I stacked my financial statements. His visits were short, his hugs half-hearted, and his conversations always steered towards practicalities, never emotions. It hurt in ways I couldn't quite explain. For years, I'd been the first one up in this house, the last one to sleep. I was the one who kept the mortgage payments on track when Martin's business slowed, who refinished the back deck by hand, who spent hours painting the bedrooms, sewing the curtains, making this house feel like a home. I remembered scraping paint off window frames until my knuckles bled, fixing broken fence posts in the rain because Martin's back gave out and we couldn't afford help. I thought all that meant something. But Martin's name was the only one on the deed. We'd talked about changing it, but life always got in the way. Bills, soccer games, late shifts. Martin always waved it off with a laugh. "It's just paperwork, Celeste," he'd say. "They know this is your home." And I'd believed him because back then, love felt like it was enough to make a home permanent. Now, sitting beside Diana, I realized how fragile my claim really was. Diana's words stirred something uncomfortable inside me. "You ever wonder what happens if you don't speak up?" she asked, her voice low. I didn't answer, but the question followed me inside after she left. That evening, I stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, staring at the neatly made bed, at the photos lining the dresser. Weddings, graduations, birthdays. I'd worked hard to make special. I walked through every room like a stranger visiting someone else's house. Every wall held memories, every corner whispered stories, but none of it was legally mine. Later that week, Trevor came by again. I heard his car before I saw it, the familiar sound of tires crunching gravel. I forced a smile when I opened the door. "Damantaki." "Hey, Mom," he said. though the word felt thin, rehearsed like a role he stepped into when it suited him. Madison stayed in the car, scrolling on her phone, never bothering to come inside. Trevor made polite small talk, asked if the heating was still working, if I'd checked the roof after the last storm. He moved through the house with a practiced ease, heading straight to the stack of mail on the kitchen counter. "You get this one yet?" he asked, holding up a bank statement with my name on it. I nodded, suddenly aware of how my stomach twisted at the sight. He didn't notice my silence. He opened the refrigerator, poked around, grabbed a bottle of water without asking. His eyes flicked around the living room, lingering on the china cabinet on the antique clock Martin's father had given us. Little things I'd dusted and cared for, pieces I'd thought would stay in the family for generations. But in that moment, I realized what Trevor saw weren't memories. They were assets. When he left, he didn't mention coming back anytime soon. Just a quick, "Take care of yourself." Okay, before the door closed behind him. I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, long after his car disappeared down the street. That night I sat at the kitchen table sifting through documents. The house was in Martin's name. The car was in Martin's name. The savings account we'd built together had defaulted to Trevor after Martin's death because I hadn't been listed as a joint owner. The realization settled heavy in my chest. I had poured decades of my life into building something that could be taken from me with a single legal signature. I thought about Sienna, too. Her calls had grown more transactional, checking in just enough to stay connected, but always circling back to financial questions. When was I planning to downsize? Had I looked into assisted living communities? Wasn't it exhausting keeping up with the property? She framed it as concern, but every question felt like a prelude to claiming something I hadn't agreed to give away. Diana's words played over and over in my mind. "You gotta protect what you've built, Celeste, or someone else will decide it doesn't belong to you." I didn't sleep much that night. I walked through the house again this time, counting all the ways I had made it my own. Scratches on the hardwood floors from Trevor's first puppy. The dent in the hallway wall from Sienna's soccer ball. The tiny handprints still faintly visible on the staircase banister from a long-forgotten craft project. This house wasn't just bricks and beams. It was my history, my labor, my love. And yet in the eyes of the law, it was just a property, tied to Martin, defaulting to the next of kin I had raised, but who rarely thought of me outside of holidays and financial gain. For the first time in a long while, I felt something shift inside me. A quiet anger, slow and steady, laced with a fierce determination. I had spent so long convincing myself that love would protect me, that memories were enough to guarantee belonging. But the world didn't run on love. It ran on paperwork signatures and documents that dictated who mattered when it came down to dollars and deeds. I thought about Martin's easy dismissals, about Trevor's casual entitlement, about Sienna's polite distance. I thought about all the times I was introduced as Dad's wife instead of Mom. About how no one had ever called me Mom when they thought no one was listening. And I realized I had been clinging to an illusion. It wasn't anger that took root that night. It was clarity. And for the first time in decades, I decided to do something entirely for myself. Because love, as I was beginning to understand, could be generous and forgiving, but it didn't have to be blind. And it certainly didn't have to be exploited. Sometimes all it takes is one conversation to change everything. One quiet suggestion from someone who sees what you've been too tired, too loyal, or too afraid to see. For me, that conversation happened on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting on my front porch while Diana Holloway sipped her lukewarm tea and eyed me with that steady, knowing look she always had. "You need to talk to someone who knows about these things." She said her words soft but firm. Someone who knows how to make sure what's yours doesn't end up in the wrong hands. I tried to brush it off, tried to pretend I wasn't already thinking the same thing, but Diana wasn't the kind of woman who let you retreat into your excuses. She pressed a little harder. "There's a man, Spencer Doyle," she said. "Smart, discreet. Helped my sister when her kids started hovering like vultures. Doesn't charge you a dime just for breathing either." Maybe it was the quiet way she said it, maybe it was the ache that had been building in my chest for too long. but I nodded. 2 days later, I was sitting across from Spencer Doyle in his modest office on the corner of Main Street. Spencer wasn't flashy. He didn't have marble floors or gold-plated business cards. His office smelled like old paper and fresh coffee, and the walls were lined with simple shelves filled with thick legal books. But there was something in his handshake, firm, no nonsense, that made me feel like for the first time in years I was stepping into a space where my words would matter. I sat down clutching the manila envelope in my lap like it was my last lifeline. Inside were all the pieces of my life reduced to paperwork. The old will Martin had drawn up before his cancer diagnosis, the deed to the house that never had my name on it, insurance policies, and one creased letter written in messy blue ink. Madeline Lake's handwriting. Spencer waited patiently as I fumbled with the envelope, my fingers shaking a little as I pulled everything out and laid it in front of him. "I don't even know where to start," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. He adjusted his glasses, flipping through the documents with practiced efficiency. "Why don't you tell me what's keeping you up at night?" he said simply. "And we'll go from there." So I did. I told him about the years I'd spent raising Trevor and Sienna, about Martin's promises that love mattered more than paperwork, about the shifting distance after Martin passed. I told him about the cold dinners, the forgotten holidays, the veiled comments about downsizing, about the growing realization that the home I built was nothing more than a prize to them, something they were quietly circling like scavengers waiting for the right moment. And I told him about Madeline Lake. Madeline wasn't family. She wasn't a blood relative, not a stepchild, not legally tied to me in any way. But she was the only person who had checked on me without asking for anything. Years ago, when she was just a little girl with nowhere to go after her mother's addiction spiraled out of control, she'd spent 6 months living under my roof, wrapped in my blankets, eating my meals, calling me Miss Celeste, in a voice that trembled, but trusted. Madeline was grown now, living 3 states over, working in a shelter, helping women find their footing again. But every birthday, every holiday, every random Tuesday, she never failed to send me a letter. Real paper, real handwriting, little notes that said "thinking of you" or "hope you're doing okay." She never once asked about inheritance, never hinted at money. She just remembered me. When I was at my loneliest, her letters reminded me that I had mattered to someone. I slid her letter across the desk toward Spencer. "I want everything to go to her," I said, hearing the firmness in my own voice for the first time. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Everything. All of it," I said. "The house, the savings, the insurance, every last bit." There was no hesitation in his movements as he pulled out a fresh file. "We can absolutely do that," he said, "but we're going to be smart about it." I blinked. Smart Spencer leaned forward slightly. "Quiet," he explained. "You don't make noise about something like this, Celeste. Not with the way your situation's been unfolding. We'll put protections in place. Create legal barriers. By the time they realize anything's changed, it'll already be done." The words settled over me like the first breath after being underwater too long. For months, maybe years, I had felt like I was watching my life slip away through the cracks of old promises and outdated documents. Now, for the first time, someone was offering me a way to take it back. We spent hours reviewing every detail. Spencer explained everything in plain language, no fancy jargon meant to confuse. He told me exactly how we would revoke the old will, how we would transfer ownership, how to structure everything so there would be no loopholes, no back doors. Trevor or Sienna could sneak through after I was gone. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but I didn't. There was something profoundly steadying about sitting there signing new documents, watching my name, my full legal name, appear where it had never been before. Property owner, beneficiary designator, decision maker. It was the first time in decades I realized just how much I had given away without asking for anything in return. When everything was signed, notarized, sealed, Spencer slid a final folder toward me. "This is your copy," he said. "Keep it somewhere safe. You have full control now, Celeste, and nobody needs to know until you want them to. I gathered the folder carefully, feeling the weight of it settle in my bag. It wasn't just paper. It was a reclaiming of everything I had spent my life building. Before I left, I turned back to Spencer. "Do people do this a lot?" I asked, curious. His smile was thin, knowing. "More than you'd think," he said. "There are a lot of women like you who are told to trust love over legal rights. But love doesn't pay the bills, and it sure doesn't stop opportunistic children from circling." His honesty stung a little, but it also freed something inside me. As I stepped out of Spencer's office, the late afternoon sun was already slanting low across the street. I stood there for a long moment, clutching my bag to my chest, letting the warmth soak into my skin. For the first time since Martin's death, I didn't feel like a guest in my own life. I felt ownership of my choices, of my future, of my peace. And as I walked to my car, my steps felt lighter, steadier. Because I had finally understood something no one had ever told me before. Sometimes the quietest revenge is taking back what was always yours. And this time, I wouldn't leave my fate in anyone else's hands. I used to think you could feel it coming, the exact moment when your life shifts, when the walls you built start to crack. But the truth is, it doesn't happen like that. There are no sirens, no flashing lights. Sometimes it sneaks up on you during a quiet Tuesday morning with something as ordinary as a phone call from your stepdaughter. It was Sienna. Her voice was light, pleasant even. "Hi, Celeste. I was wondering if I could borrow your car for a day or two," she said. "It's just that mine's in the shop and I've got a few errands to run." I didn't think twice. Of course I said yes. That's what I always did. Say yes. Even when my gut whispered otherwise, even when I hadn't seen her in months, even when the conversations had turned transactional and cold. I handed over the keys without hesitation. I reminded her to top off the gas and double-check the brakes because the car was old, and things had been feeling just a little off lately. She smiled, nodded, promised to be careful, and off she went, her taillights disappearing down the road like it was any other day. When the car came back the next evening, nothing seemed out of place. The gas tank was full. The inside was tidied up. The mirrors were slightly adjusted, the seat pushed forward, but those were things you notice without really noticing. I didn't ask questions. I just tucked the keys into the drawer by the door like I always did, and got on with my evening. The next morning, it happened. I was on my way to the grocery store thinking about whether to pick up extra eggs for Diana's lemon bars, thinking about the hydrangeas that needed trimming, about a quiet afternoon ahead with a good book. Then I pressed the brake pedal as I approached a stoplight, and it sank to the floor like I had stepped on air. I remember the moment in sharp, jagged pieces. The car speeding forward when it should have stopped. The world tilting sideways. My hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white, slamming the brakes again harder this time, but getting nothing in return. Just a horrifying, hollow silence beneath my foot, like the car had decided I no longer mattered. There wasn't time to panic. There wasn't time to think. I tried to veer toward the shoulder to avoid the intersection ahead, but the car spun tires, screeching the world a blur of motion and sound. I remember the metallic crunch, the shattering glass, the way the world went completely, utterly quiet after the impact. And then blackness. I don't know how long I was unconscious. I don't remember the ambulance ride, the emergency room, or the doctors hovering above me. What I remember clear as day is waking up in a hospital bed, my body heavy with wires and bandages, and hearing voices at the foot of my bed that cut deeper than any injury I'd sustained. Trevor's voice flat, bored, like he was discussing grocery lists. "She's not going to make it through this," he said. "And honestly, it's probably for the best. She's just been holding onto that house too long." Sienna's reply cold as steel. "Yeah, this'll make things a lot easier. Everything's already supposed to transfer over, right? The insurance, too." I wanted to believe I was dreaming, that the drugs pumping through my IV had conjured up some nightmare. But I wasn't dreaming. My eyes were closed, but my ears were wide open. Every word they said pierced straight through me. Trevor's voice, again, careless. "I mean, we've been patient. She's had enough years in that house. Madison already found a real estate agent who's interested. Sienna snorted softly. I just want to get it over with. Clear it out, put it on the market, maybe get something nice for myself. Honestly, she was just a placeholder after Dad anyway. A placeholder. That word echoed in my chest, louder than the monitor beeping beside me, louder than the whispers of nurses shuffling past the door. A placeholder. Not a mother. Not family. Just someone who happened to be there filling space until they could collect the reward. I couldn't move. My body was too broken, too battered, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I lay there completely still, letting their words slice through me, letting the betrayal settle deep in my bones. It was strange. The pain of the accident was nothing compared to the pain of realizing the people I had given my life to were standing at my deathbed, not in grief, but in calculation. The nurse came in then, her shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum. She cleared her throat, the sound cutting through their conversation like a blade. Maybe you two should step outside, she said, her tone professional but firm. Trevor huffed. Fine, whatever, he muttered. I heard him stand the scrape of the chair against the floor, the shuffle of footsteps. Sienna followed her perfume lingering in the room long after they were gone. I kept my eyes closed, my breaths shallow, pretending to be as helpless as they clearly thought I was. The nurse adjusted the monitors, her hands gentle as she checked the IV. Then she leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. You don't have to pretend with me, she said quietly. I know you're awake. I saw the way your heart rate spiked when they started talking. I didn't move, but something inside me shifted. I wasn't alone in this room. Not completely. The nurse, whose name tag read Evelyn, continued softly. You rest now. Let them think whatever they want to think. You've got time to figure out your next move. She patted my hand once, then left the room, leaving me in the quiet hum of hospital machinery and my own raging thoughts. I had spent decades in that house, decades nurturing children who weren't mine by blood, but who I had loved as if they were. I had sacrificed holidays, late nights, my health, my happiness, believing that love, consistency, and care would earn me a place in their hearts. But to them, I had been nothing more than a bridge to money and property, a temporary inconvenience standing between them and their inheritance. As I lay there, tubes in my arms, ribs aching, I realized something so deeply it settled in my bones. They thought I was as good as dead. They thought I was too broken to fight back, too weak to stand in their way. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Because while my body might have been fragile, my will had just been sharpened to a steel point. And if they wanted a fight, they were about to get one, without a single raised voice, without a single dramatic scene. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't beg. I would stay silent. I would listen. And when the time was right, I would make sure they lost everything they thought they were so close to stealing. There's a power in silence that most people don't understand. They think staying quiet means surrender means weakness. But I've learned silence can be a weapon. It can be armor. It can be the calm before the storm you never see coming. That's exactly what it became for me. I stayed quiet in that hospital bed, letting Trevor and Sienna believe I was as good as gone. I listened. I memorized every word, every cold calculation, every whispered scheme. And while my body healed inch by inch, my mind sharpened clearer than it had been in years. Evelyn, the nurse who had seen through my charade, became my first quiet ally. She had this way of moving through the room, adjusting machines, fluffing pillows, and all the while pretending like everything was perfectly ordinary. But beneath that calm exterior was someone who had seen enough people used and discarded to know exactly what was happening. One night when the halls were quiet, she slipped a small recorder into my hand. It's simple, she said in a whisper. One button. I'll place it under the bed when they visit. Just let it run. Her smile was small but fierce. No one's going to silence you, Celeste. Not this time. I clutched that little recorder like it was a lifeline. The next time Trevor visited, I didn't react. I let my eyelids flutter just enough to make him think I was still out of it. I heard him rifling through my personal drawer, muttering to himself about how long the probate process might take. He was on the phone with Madison at one point, his voice low but dripping with entitlement, talking about how we'll just put it on the market as soon as we get control of everything. I didn't flinch. I let the recorder gather every word, every greedy thought spoken out loud in a room where they assumed I was already halfway to the grave, and I wasn't done. Evelyn knew a lawyer couldn't act fast enough without more solid proof. "You need someone who digs deep," she whispered one morning while pretending to adjust my IV drip. "Someone who looks under every rock." Spencer Doyle, my lawyer, agreed. "I know a man," he said calmly over the phone once I'd signaled I was ready to fight back. Not flashy, not the kind to advertise his services, but efficient, discreet. His name's Graham Slater, ex-law enforcement, now a private investigator. He specializes in situations like yours. Within 2 days, Graham was in my hospital room. He didn't wear a suit, didn't carry a briefcase, just a well-worn jacket and a quiet confidence that immediately settled my nerves. "Ms. Monroe," he nodded, pulling up a chair beside my bed. "I already reviewed the basics." Spencer gave me the file. "You have concerns over your stepchildren, the condition of your vehicle, and what seems to be financial maneuvering happening behind your back." I nodded weakly, my body still stiff but my determination unshaken. "I don't want suspicions," I rasped. "I want proof." Graham smiled, slow and steady. "That's exactly what I do." He started with the car. Within days, he had pulled the vehicle from the impound lot, had it inspected by a trusted mechanic. The results came back quickly. Clean cuts in the brake line, not wear and tear, not old age, deliberate, tampered. Next, he looked into surveillance footage. Diana, ever the observant neighbor, had her porch camera running. Graham retrieved weeks of footage watching every visit Trevor and Sienna made. He noted their timing, their behavior, and on one particular evening, captured Trevor slipping out of the house late at night after visiting me. 5 minutes later, my car was moved. The timestamp didn't lie. Graham dug deeper. He found records of recent inquiries Sienna made into power of attorney forms, real estate evaluations for my house, even life insurance policy updates she attempted to initiate without my knowledge. "You were right to trust your instincts," Graham told me, flipping through his growing file of evidence. "They've been planning this systematically." I felt the fury boil under my skin, but I didn't let it consume me. I let it fuel me. Evelyn helped set up a second recording session. This time it was Sienna who came by, pretending to fluff my pillows, acting the dutiful daughter. But her words betrayed her. She stood by my bedside, whispering into her phone about liquidating my assets quickly, about moving the process along before Celeste gets dragged out on life support for too long. I signed papers from my hospital bed. Spencer brought them in carefully, explaining each document with the patience of someone who knew I wasn't just trying to protect assets, I was reclaiming my life. The new paperwork reinforced my will. It cemented my medical directives, cutting Trevor and Sienna out of every possible avenue of decision-making. It transferred ownership of my home directly to Madeline Lake through a living trust, removing the risk of probate altogether. My bank accounts were restructured, my insurance policies redirected. Spencer worked methodically, quietly like a surgeon, fixing what had been broken for too long. Each signature I scrawled with my shaky hand felt like I was stitching myself back together. Meanwhile, Graham wasn't done. He began watching patterns. He tracked Trevor's banking habits, noticed sudden deposits from unknown sources, payments made to a private investigator Trevor had hired, likely to monitor my condition. He retrieved hospital visitor logs, noting Trevor's and Sienna's exact times. He pulled footage from the hospital parking lot, capturing Sienna returning my car hours before my crash. A smug expression plastered across her face as she walked away. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and with each new revelation, I felt less like a helpless patient and more like a woman reclaiming her power. By the time I was strong enough to sit up in bed on my own, the folder Graham handed to Spencer was thicker than my hospital chart. Concrete evidence, audio recordings, Surveillance footage, forensic reports, financial records, all painting a picture of calculated betrayal. You've got enough here to press criminal charges. Spencer told me, his tone quiet but resolute. You're not just protecting your estate, Celeste. You're stopping a crime in progress. And I didn't hesitate. I pressed my pen firmly against the page, authorizing Spencer to initiate the first steps toward legal action. For too long, I'd let love blind me to what was happening around me. I'd excused distance as busyness, cruelty, as oversight and manipulation as concern. I'd let them circle me like vultures, thinking their birthright gave them claim to everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed for. But I wasn't dying as a victim. I was living as a woman who had finally decided enough was enough. And as I signed the final document, a steady calm settled in my chest. Because Trevor and Sienna thought they were counting down my final breaths. What they didn't know was that I was just getting started. When the day finally came for me to leave the hospital, it wasn't with the fanfare of grateful children waiting by my bedside. There were no teary goodbyes from Trevor, no warm hugs from Sienna. I left quietly, just as I had decided to fight quietly. Evelyn wheeled me out through a private exit while Graham handled the paperwork. My discharge wasn't public, wasn't discussed, wasn't broadcasted. By the time they realized I was gone, the world around them had already shifted. My house no longer belonged to me. And that was the point. It belonged to Madeline now. Under a living trust, protected from probate, protected from the entitled hands that had spent too long calculating my death, like a business opportunity. Spencer made sure of that. Every detail finalized, every signature in place, every transfer certified. My assets, my home, even my grandmother's pearl earrings. They had all been quietly moved into safe hands, while Trevor and Sienna were still whispering about life insurance policies and property sales. I didn't go back to the house. I didn't even drive past it. Graham arranged a modest rental apartment for me in a quiet neighborhood 2 towns over, just far enough away that the air felt different. The furniture was simple, the space small, but for the first time in years, everything inside those walls was truly mine. No ghosts of ungrateful children, no echoes of cold laughter, just peace. And silence, I chose. Meanwhile, back in the world, I left behind Trevor, and Sienna had no clue what was waiting for them. They arrived at the hospital a day later, assuming I was still there, still unconscious, still conveniently close to the grave they'd been counting on. Madison stayed in the car. Sienna stormed inside with purpose, and Trevor strutted up to the nurse's station like he was someone of importance. They were met by a young nurse who calmly checked her records and blinked up at them with polite confusion. "Celeste Monroe was discharged last night," she said simply. I can only imagine the silence that must have followed. Graham described it to me later. How Trevor's jaw clenched, how Sienna's face paled before snapping into irritation. Who authorized that Trevor had demanded, trying to raise his voice, trying to play the role of concerned next of kin? But the nurse, perfectly trained, perfectly professional, handed them an envelope without emotion. Per her legal team's instructions. "I was told to give you this." Inside the envelope wasn't an update on my health. There were no next steps for care, no decisions for them to make. There was a letter, short, simple, and final. "You are no longer my heirs." I didn't waste words. I didn't explain myself. They knew why. Deep down, they'd always known. They just thought I'd never have the strength to follow through. Graham told me Sienna went pale, gripping the paper so tightly it crumpled in her hand. Trevor fumed, face red, muttering under his breath about lawyers and not how this was supposed to go. But none of their panic could undo what had already been done. They left the hospital in a hurry, racing back to the house they believed would be their inheritance, thinking they'd barge inside, dig through paperwork, seize control of what they thought was theirs by default. But they found something else. By the time they pulled into the driveway, my house had been visited by a new kind of guest, the property manager Spencer had appointed through the trust. A neatly dressed professional, clipboard in hand, waiting patiently on the front porch when Trevor's car screeched to a stop. They stormed up the walkway demanding explanations, throwing out phrases like rights and next of kin, like weapons they no longer had permission to wield. But the property manager remained calm. This property, he explained, is now legally under the management of Monroe Haven Trust. All prior rights of access have been revoked, effective immediately. Trevor didn't believe him. Of course he didn't. He stomped to the front door, pulling out the key he'd kept on his ring all these years. The same key he had used to let himself in whenever he wanted, whenever it was convenient to pop by and pick up checks or rummage through paperwork. He shoved the key into the lock, and it didn't budge. The locks had been changed, reinforced. "This is my family home," he'd growled, according to Graham, who had been watching from his car across the street, documenting every second for the legal file. The property manager remained professional. Not anymore. Sienna circled to the back, thinking maybe the garage entrance, the side door, the back patio, maybe those remained untouched. But every entry point had been secured, every door fitted with new locks, every window sealed and monitored. When Trevor and Sienna demanded answers, the property manager simply handed them another envelope, this one bearing Spencer's firm's seal. Inside 2 letters awaited them, each identical except for the names at the top. "Effective immediately, you are no longer permitted to access or represent any property formerly belonging to Celeste Monroe. Any attempt to enter these premises will be treated as unlawful trespassing and referred to the proper legal authorities. Further details have been sent to your respective legal representatives." There was no long explanation, no drawn-out justification, no room for debate. Trevor tried to argue, to throw his weight around, but the property manager cut him off with a single line. "If you'd like to contest this," he said, "you're welcome to have your lawyer contact Ms. Monroe's legal team." I heard later that Trevor stormed off to his car, slamming the door so hard the side mirror rattled. Sienna stayed a little longer pacing in the driveway, staring at the house like it had personally betrayed her, like the walls and the garden beds and the porch swing had conspired against her entitlement. They left with nothing. No access, no keys, no claim. And me, I spent that evening drinking a quiet cup of tea in my little apartment, the city lights soft beyond my window. Graham called to update me, his tone amused, steady, supportive. "They didn't see it coming," he said simply. "Good, because that's what betrayal earns you. Not a confrontation, not a screaming match. Just a locked door, a revoked privilege, a future they never bothered to nurture, shutting its gates in their faces." And as I sat in my new space in my quiet, peaceful corner of the world, I finally felt it settle within me. They didn't just lose access to a house. They lost access to me, and they were never getting it back. There's a certain clarity that comes after betrayal, like standing on a cliff edge looking down and realizing the drop isn't nearly as terrifying as the people who pushed you there. After everything, after the hospital bed, the poisoned whispers, the locked doors, I thought I'd feel relief, and I did. But what came next wasn't just peace, it was purpose. Graham didn't slow down after we secured the house. If anything, that was just the beginning. The evidence we had gathered was enough to keep Trevor and Sienna away from my property, but I wasn't interested in just locking the door behind me. I wanted the full truth. I wanted to know how far the rot had spread. I wanted everything they had tried to hide brought into the light. I remember the first time Graham said it aloud. He sat across from me in the modest living room of my little rental, flipping through a thick manila folder, his tone calm but unflinching. "They weren't just circling the house, Celeste," he said. "They were planning something much bigger." And I believed him, because the more we dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't thoughtlessness. This was a calculated plan years in the making. Graham started with the obvious, the car. We already knew the brake lines had been cut, but he wanted to confirm every detail. He hired an independent forensic mechanic, someone with no ties to local politics or law enforcement, someone whose report couldn't be dismissed or twisted in court. The conclusion came back quickly: deliberate tampering, clean cuts, precision work, no signs of age-related failure. But Graham didn't stop there. He requested transaction reports from every mechanic my car had been taken to in the past year. And there it was. 2 weeks before the crash, a service appointment logged under Sienna's name at a little repair shop 2 towns over. A cash payment, no receipts emailed, no trace back to me. Just a quiet visit, an off-the-books interaction, and a few days later a car that nearly killed me. My chest tightened when I read the report, but I stayed quiet. I was learning the power of silence, learning how to let facts speak louder than emotion. Then came the bank records. Graham had access to financial investigators who could follow digital trails the way most of us follow recipes. They pulled statements, analyzed deposits, tracked spending patterns, and what they found, well, it made my stomach turn. Trevor had been accessing my mail regularly, not just casually checking on bills like he pretended, but monitoring incoming statements, opening them, rerouting certain notices to his own address when he thought I wouldn't notice. Several accounts had been altered months before my accident with Trevor, listed as a secondary contact, or emergency access point. Sienna's digital footprint was no better. She'd been digging into my insurance policies, making inquiries about beneficiary changes, even contacting brokers pretending to be acting on my behalf. One particularly bold email had her asking for early payouts on certain accounts if medical complications accelerated the timeline. Accelerated the timeline. That phrase stuck with me like a splinter in the skin. But Graham wasn't done. He went to Diana. My neighbor, my quiet protector. The woman who had seen the shifts I had ignored for too long. She didn't hesitate when Graham knocked on her door. "I've got footage," Diana said, like she'd been waiting for someone to finally ask. She had kept her porch cameras rolling. She'd witnessed Trevor letting himself into my house when I wasn't home, staying just long enough to shuffle through my filing cabinets, pulling out folders, snapping photos with his phone, and slipping things back in just enough to make it look undisturbed. Graham cross-referenced dates. Sure enough, in the days after Trevor's unannounced visits, changes appeared on my bank records policies and even my household bills. Sienna would conveniently call the next week, bringing up topics that matched the documents Trevor had peeked at, things she couldn't have known otherwise. It was a pattern, a coordinated, systematic campaign to bleed me dry while I was alive, and make sure they benefited quickly after I wasn't. I sat through the meetings, listened through the recordings, read every page Graham brought me. There were nights when the weight of it felt crushing, when every breath came with the sting of betrayal. But then I'd remember this time I wasn't sitting in the dark, waiting to be discarded. This time I was documenting. I was preparing. Spencer worked in tandem with Graham. While Graham chased every thread of the financial deceit, Spencer began assembling the legal case. He knew the laws. He knew exactly how to frame the evidence to expose the abuse, not just emotionally but financially and physically. Elder financial exploitation. Spencer explained to me one morning over coffee. Elder endangerment, fraud, possible attempted bodily harm. His tone was steady matter of fact, but I could see the fire in his eyes. This isn't a family dispute, Celeste. This is a crime. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told me straight pressing charges would be messy. There'd be court hearings, paperwork, testimony. My name might end up in records, maybe even the local news. But I didn't flinch. I wasn't interested in being invisible anymore. I wanted the truth known. Not just for me, but for every woman like me who'd been told to stay quiet, to be grateful, to overlook the knives pointed at her back. The file grew thicker by the week. There were affidavits from financial experts, forensic mechanics, and neighbors. Diana gave a written statement. Evelyn added her testimony, recalling the chilling words Trevor and Sienna had whispered at my hospital bedside. Graham pulled surveillance footage from local traffic cameras, showing Sienna's car trailing behind me in the hours before the crash. Proof she'd been in town when she claimed to be out of state. It was undeniable, and it was time. Spencer submitted the completed case to the county district attorney's office. Charges were filed. Formal complaints were lodged. Restraining orders were secured to keep Trevor and Sienna from coming within 500 feet of me or any property tied to my name. I wasn't just removing them from my life. I was holding them accountable. And as Spencer clicked his pen shut that final afternoon, handing me copies of every filed document, I felt something shift deep in my bones. It wasn't revenge. Not really. It was reclamation. I had spent years, decades, believing my role was to give, to forgive, to absorb. I had mistaken silence for grace, mistaken sacrifice for duty. But standing there watching Spencer close the case file with a satisfying thud, I realized I had just done the bravest thing of all. I had chosen myself. Trevor and Sienna didn't know it yet. They still thought they had time, still thought I was out there grieving quietly, licking old wounds too beaten down to fight back, but soon enough they'd see the truth. And this time it wouldn't be a quiet conversation behind hospital doors. This time it would be their names on the courtroom docket, and I'd be sitting in the front row, finally fully free. It didn't take long for the walls to finally come crashing down. The moment Spencer filed the charges and the district attorney's office saw the mountain of evidence, the wheels of justice began turning faster than I had expected. Maybe it was the shocking clarity of the audio recordings, or the coldness dripping from Sienna's emails. Or maybe it was just the simple, irrefutable fact that some betrayals leave too many scars to ignore. Whatever it was, the law acted. I didn't see it firsthand, but Graham did. He told me about the day the police knocked on Trevor's front door, how Trevor had opened it with that same smug confidence only for his face to collapse into panic when the officers read out the charges. Elder financial abuse attempted, fraud attempted, vehicular sabotage. Madison, who had always played the doting wife in public, stood frozen in their living room, clutching her phone like it could shield her from the truth unraveling in front of her. Sienna's arrest was quieter, but no less humiliating. She was led out of her office in handcuffs, her carefully curated professional image shattered in a single afternoon. Her co-workers whispered behind cubicles, eyes wide with disbelief, as the reality sank in. Graham said she didn't protest much, just kept her head down, her lips pressed tight like she already knew it was too late to undo what she had done. The media caught wind of the case, as these things tend to happen. Small-town gossip turns to local headlines and then beyond. At first I stayed away from it. I didn't want to see my name plastered under sensational headlines. But Spencer advised me otherwise. "You have nothing to hide, Celeste," he said calmly. "This isn't about shame. This is about setting an example." And he was right. Madeline stepped forward on my behalf. She stood in front of the courthouse the day of the preliminary hearing, dressed simply, no fancy makeup, no rehearsed lines. Just honesty. Microphones crowded around her, reporters eager for a soundbite, but she didn't flinch. "I'm standing here today," she began, "because for too long too many women have been told their love must come without boundaries, that their sacrifice must be silent, that their years of devotion don't need protecting. What happened to Celeste Monroe happens to thousands of women, mothers, stepmothers, grandmothers, every year, and it needs to stop." The statement went viral faster than any of us expected. It resonated because it was raw, because it was truth spoken without bitterness, because it struck a chord in every person who had ever been quietly discarded after giving too much of themselves. And then came the verdict. The trial was public. The evidence was overwhelming. The defense tried to argue confusion, misunderstanding, misplaced intentions. But the prosecution had the receipts: emails, surveillance footage, forensic reports, voice recordings that painted a picture so undeniable, even the most skeptical juror couldn't look away. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. Trevor and Sienna were found guilty on all counts. Their sentencing hearing was scheduled for a month later, but the court's decision was already loud and clear. They wouldn't be walking away from this. Not this time. I watched from a distance. I didn't need to be in the courtroom. I had nothing left to prove to them. They had made their choice, and now they would live with the consequences. But I didn't just walk away with a legal victory. I walked away with something more powerful: freedom. Spencer finalized the transfer of my home into the trust. But Madeline had a proposal, one that had been brewing quietly as she watched everything unfold. "I don't want the house just for me," she said during one of our long phone calls. "I think we can do something more meaningful." And so we did. The Monroe House became Monroe Haven, a transitional home for women recovering from familial betrayal. For women like me who had given and given until they were empty, who had been made to feel invisible, discarded, or used. Monroe Haven opened its doors quietly with no grand ceremony, just a simple promise painted above the entrance. This place belongs to those who have been forgotten. Madeline ran it with grace. Diana became an honorary advisor, her keen eye helping spot others in the community who needed protection. Even Evelyn, my quiet nurse, visited often, volunteering her time to help guide women through their recovery. The house that once held my sacrifices now echoed with the quiet laughter of women finding themselves again. And me, I didn't stay. I packed a single suitcase and moved to a small village by the coast 3 hours away, where no one knew my story, where no one whispered about the headlines or remembered me as a stepmother who was betrayed. I bought a tiny cottage with a view of the ocean where mornings smelled like salt and coffee, and evenings sang with the wind brushing through pine trees. I spent my days walking along the shore writing letters to Madeline, helping from a distance when she needed guidance. I learned how to enjoy the simple peace of being a person with no labels, no burdens, no obligations to those who had drained me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't Celeste the caregiver. I wasn't Celeste the stepmother, the widow, the woman people turned to when they needed something. I was just Celeste. And it was enough. It's funny how life has a way of quietly rearranging itself once you decide to stop carrying the weight of other people's expectations. After everything, the betrayal, the trial, the headlines, I thought my story had ended with the closing of courtroom doors. But in truth, that was just the end of one chapter. What came after surprised me more than anything else. I wasn't alone. The letters came slowly at first. A small envelope slipped through the mail slot, no return address, shaky handwriting on the front. Inside, just a few lines, I thought I was the only one. Thank you for proving me wrong. Then another, then dozens more. Emails, handwritten notes, little packages with no-frills cards from women across the country, and even from across the ocean. Women who had spent years feeling invisible. Women who had been pushed aside by the very people they had sacrificed for. Women who were told to be quiet, to be small, to endure for the sake of family. And now they saw something in my story that reminded them they were worth more. One woman wrote from Montana describing how she'd raised her husband's children after their mother left, only to be tossed out of her home after he passed. She wrote, "I thought love would protect me. I was wrong. But hearing your story helped me call a lawyer for the first time." Another wrote from a small town in Georgia saying, "I gave up my dreams to hold my family together and they forgot me as soon as I couldn't offer them anything else. But you reminded me it's not too late to choose myself." I read every single letter, every email, every message. I sat on my small porch by the sea sipping tea while the wind carried their voices to me. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a footnote in someone else's story. I felt seen. Not because I had been a mother figure, not because I had sacrificed, but because I had chosen to stand back up. The day I wrote my final letter was a quiet one. The sky was soft and overcast, the ocean unusually calm, as if it too had decided to rest. I sat at my kitchen table with a simple piece of paper and no intention of sending it to anyone but myself. I wrote slowly, carefully, like I wanted every word to linger. I was never their mother, but I was always someone worth loving. I folded the letter and slipped it into the back of my favorite book tucked between pages I often revisited when I needed to feel strong. It wasn't for anyone else. It was a promise to myself, a soft reminder that after everything, after all the roles people tried to stuff me into, I had always been enough. Madeline visited a few weeks later, bringing news from Monroe Haven. The house had become a refuge, a second chance, just like we had hoped. The bedrooms I once dusted for ungrateful stepchildren were now quiet sanctuaries for women healing from their own betrayals. The garden I had tended with sore knees and calloused hands was blooming again this time, nurtured by women planting roots not for anyone else but for themselves. There's laughter in the kitchen again. Madeline told me eyes bright. There's peace in the halls. You'd be proud. I didn't need to visit to know she was right. That house no longer belonged to a version of me that had suffered in silence. It belonged to a sisterhood of women who had chosen to reclaim their worth. Diana wrote me occasionally 2 little notes, scribbled in her straightforward tone. Another one came to Monroe Haven yesterday. One letter said, a woman in her 60s who'd been living in her car after her kids pushed her out. She's got her own room now, her first night sleeping without fear. You did that, Celeste. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice in the loud, dramatic sense. It was something simpler, quieter. Restoration, not of property, not of money, but of dignity. And me, I found comfort in routines I once thought too small to matter. Waking up to sunlight creeping through curtains I chose. Making breakfast just for me. Long, unhurried walks by the water. Planting flowers because I liked how they looked, not because anyone else needed to be impressed. Even learning to bake again, not because someone demanded it, but because I wanted to smell vanilla and cinnamon filling my home. No one called me stepmom anymore. No one knocked on my door asking for money. No one peered through my windows with greed in their eyes. I had no more roles to fill, no more debts to repay. I was simply Celeste. And it was more than enough. Sometimes, at sunset, I'd sit on the porch with a light blanket over my knees, a mug of tea warming my hands, and I'd let my thoughts drift. Not to Trevor or Sienna. They were just shadows in a distant life, now names on a court docket I didn't care to revisit. I thought about the women who wrote me, the ones who walked through the doors of Monroe Haven with their heads bowed low but left with their spines straight. I thought about the version of myself that had believed love meant endless sacrifice. I thought about how she had been wrong, but also about how she had been brave. Brave to love, brave to give, and finally brave enough to stop. Life didn't end when they betrayed me. It didn't end when they tried to erase me. It began the moment I realized I didn't need to be chosen by them to be valuable. It began when I chose myself. And in the quiet of my seaside home with the world carrying on without me, I had never felt more alive. Not as a mother, not as a caregiver, not as someone's afterthought, but as a woman who had walked through fire and found something beautiful on the other side. Me. Thank you for listening to my story. Have you ever given so much of yourself to someone only to feel invisible in return? Have you ever stayed quiet when you should have stood up for yourself? If this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of your own strength or your own quiet sacrifices, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your story matters too. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss more stories like this. Stories about dignity, quiet strength, and finding peace after pain. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are always worth remembering.